Shaquille O'Neal boarded the first-class section of the Boeing 747 with quiet humility, his massive frame moving gracefully through the narrow aisle. He wore a simple gray hoodie and a low-brim baseball cap, intentionally blending into the background. This was not a trip for luxury or indulgence. This was a mission that had consumed years of his life, fueled by a purpose greater than himself. He was on his way to the grand opening of a heart hospital for underprivileged children, a project he had poured his soul into. This wasn't just another charity initiative with his name attached. Shaq had been at the forefront of this effort, rallying NBA benefactors, community leaders, and fans alike to turn a dream into reality. The hospital was not just a building. It was hope, a promise that every child, regardless of background, would receive the care they deserved. As he placed his small carry-on bag into the overhead compartment, Shaq felt the weight of his responsibilities settle on his shoulders. He had spent countless hours ensuring that everything would be ready for the hospital's opening. This was not about fame or recognition. It was about saving lives. Settling into his seat by the window, he exhaled slowly, allowing himself a rare moment of quiet before the whirlwind of tomorrow's event. But even here, in the stillness of the cabin, he could sense it, the unspoken judgment lingering in the glances around him. Some passengers looked at him with curiosity, others with a subtle skepticism, as if questioning his presence in first class. Shaq had spent a lifetime navigating the assumptions of others. He had seen these looks before, the quiet prejudices that followed him even outside the basketball court, but he had never let them define him. He had a purpose far greater than proving himself to strangers. What he didn't know, however, was that this flight would soon turn into something far beyond a quiet journey. A lesson in respect was about to unfold, one that would leave everyone on board stunned. Shaquille O'Neal sat in his first-class seat, gazing out the window as the cabin settled into quiet anticipation before takeoff. He had no interest in small talk or drawing attention to himself. His mind was focused on the hospital opening, on the lives that would be changed by the facility he had worked so hard to help build. But the peace he sought was short-lived. A sharp voice cut through the calm. "Excuse me, are you sure you're in the right seat?" Shaq turned his head, his gaze landing on a middle-aged man standing in the aisle. He was impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit, his expression one of subtle condescension. There was no mistaking the skepticism in his eyes, the kind Shaq had encountered far too often in spaces where people silently questioned his presence. "Yes," Shaq replied evenly. "This is my seat." The man let out a small chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "I see. You must be one of those special cases, a guest or something." Shaq exhaled slowly, unwilling to let the comment provoke him. He had spent a lifetime defying assumptions. He wasn't about to let one man's ignorance ruin his flight. But the man wasn't finished. He looked Shaq up and down, as if trying to make sense of his presence among the elite travelers in first class. "First class isn't just about a seat," the man continued, his voice carrying through the cabin. "It's about status. Not everyone belongs here." The air in the cabin grew heavier. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, stealing glances at Shaq but saying nothing. The flight attendants, still preparing for departure, seemed unaware of the growing tension. Shaq closed his tablet, setting it gently on his lap. He had dealt with ignorance before, but there was something about this man's smug certainty that made the moment feel different. The words weren't just about him. They echoed the quiet prejudices that so many faced, the unspoken rules that dictated who was allowed in certain spaces. He met the man's gaze, his voice calm but firm. "You're right. First class isn't just about a seat," he said. "It's about respect." For the first time, the man hesitated. He had expected defensiveness or anger, not the quiet confidence Shaq exuded. But pride refused to let him back down. "Well," the man huffed, straightening his posture, "let's see what the flight attendant has to say about this." With that, he turned and strode down the aisle, his voice carrying a smug certainty. Shaq let out a quiet sigh and turned back toward the window. He had hoped to avoid unnecessary attention, but now he could feel the weight of every curious glance in the cabin. He had done nothing wrong, but once again, he was about to be put in a position where he would have to prove he belonged. The flight attendant approached cautiously, her professional demeanor masking the tension simmering beneath the surface. The first-class cabin, once a quiet sanctuary of luxury, now buzzed with unease. The well-dressed man who had confronted Shaquille O'Neal stood rigid, arms crossed, his expression twisted in quiet indignation. He turned to the flight attendant with the confidence of someone certain they were in the right. "This gentleman," he said, his voice laced with condescension, "seems to be confused about his seat assignment. I believe there's been a mistake." Shaq remained seated, his towering frame exuding calm authority. He had seen this before, the quiet hostility, the need to diminish someone based on appearances alone. He had endured it in his youth, in locker rooms, in boardrooms, and now even in the sky. Still, he had hoped that maybe, just maybe, today would be different. The flight attendant, a woman named Lisa, took a slow breath. Her hands clasped a tablet as she glanced at Shaq, then back at the man, who gave her an expectant look. There was hesitation in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty. Passengers nearby exchanged glances, waiting to see how the scene would unfold. "Sir," she said gently, turning toward Shaq, "may I see your boarding pass, just to confirm?" Shaq didn't hesitate. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed her the ticket. It was a simple request, one he had no reason to deny, but the underlying reason behind it was clear. She wasn't asking because there was a legitimate concern. She was asking because she was being pressured to. Lisa scanned the ticket. The information was correct. First class, window seat, no mistake. Yet, instead of immediately addressing the issue, she hesitated, looking back at the man who had caused the commotion. The energy in the cabin shifted, the unspoken rules of privilege and perception playing out in real time. The man smirked slightly, as if expecting her to uphold his unspoken belief that Shaq did not belong. Lisa's voice wavered. "Everything appears to be in order, sir," she finally said, but there was something uneasy in her tone. It wasn't firm. It wasn't final. It left room for doubt. The man scoffed. "Oh, come on," he said, shaking his head. "You're telling me he actually belongs here? Look at him. He's not like the rest of us." Silence gripped the cabin. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, while others glanced away, pretending not to hear. The words hung heavy in the air, blatant in their meaning. Shaq exhaled slowly, his gaze steady but unreadable. He could have lashed out. He could have demanded respect. But he knew something deeper. Real change never came through shouting. It came through composure, through revealing the truth in a way that left no room for argument. His voice was low but firm. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Lisa looked between them, torn between duty and discomfort. The man, realizing the eyes of the cabin were now fully on him, shifted slightly but refused to back down. "I just mean, well, first class is for people of a certain stature. People who, actually fit the part." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Shaq's jaw tightened for just a moment, but then a slow, knowing smile crossed his face. He had seen this game before. Lisa straightened her posture, sensing the tension escalating beyond her control. She cleared her throat, attempting to de-escalate. "Sir, Mr. O'Neal is a valued passenger, and his seat is completely valid. There is no issue here." The man, caught off guard by the sudden shift, opened his mouth to argue, but something stopped him. The weight of Shaq's presence, the realization that the moment was slipping from his grasp, left him momentarily speechless. Shaq leaned back slightly, his gaze still locked onto the man. "Respect," he said simply. "That's what first class should be about." The words landed with quiet force, sending a ripple through the passengers. Lisa's hesitation melted away. The man, now visibly uncomfortable, muttered something under his breath before retreating to his seat. The flight attendant nodded apologetically toward Shaq. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir." Shaq gave her a small nod but said nothing. He had made his point. The lesson had been taught. And as the flight continued its course, the air in the cabin felt different, as if something long left unchallenged had finally been addressed. Shaquille O'Neal remained seated, his fingers lightly resting on the closed tablet in front of him. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the cabin watching, waiting to see how he would respond. The man who had instigated the confrontation sat stiffly in his seat, his expression still bearing remnants of defiance, though cracks had begun to form in his composure. The flight attendant, Lisa, lingered nearby, shifting uncomfortably, as if unsure whether her presence would ease the tension or make it worse. Shaq inhaled deeply, then exhaled, his breath slow and measured. He had been in situations like this before. He knew how quickly things could escalate, how a single misplaced word could shift the balance from quiet conflict to outright confrontation. But he also knew something else true: power didn't come from volume or aggression. It came from control, from the ability to dictate the terms of the moment without ever raising one's voice. He turned his gaze toward the man, his expression unreadable but firm. "Let me ask you something," Shaq said, his voice steady, resonating with quiet authority. "What exactly makes someone worthy of sitting here?" The man hesitated, his earlier confidence faltering. He cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "Well, I mean, first class is for people of a certain stature." Shaq tilted his head slightly, considering the response. "Stature?" he repeated. "What kind of stature are we talking about? Money? Fame? A certain look?" His words hung in the air, forcing the man to confront the true meaning behind his own statement. The man pressed his lips together, unwilling to fully commit to an answer. The silence that followed was suffocating. Shaq leaned back in his seat, nodding slowly. "You know, I've spent my life in a lot of different places: locker rooms, boardrooms, communities where kids have nothing but a basketball and a dream. And I've learned something about respect. It has nothing to do with where you sit on a plane." The tension in the cabin shifted. A few passengers who had previously remained silent now looked at Shaq with something closer to admiration. The man who had challenged him, however, looked down, his fingers tightening around the armrest. Shaq continued, his voice still composed. "Respect isn't about money. It isn't about status. It's about how you treat people. And if first class is supposed to mean something, it should mean we carry ourselves with dignity, that we don't assume we know someone just by looking at them." A murmur spread through the cabin. Shaq wasn't just defending himself. He was reshaping the entire conversation. The man swallowed hard, his arrogance drained from his posture. He looked as if he wanted to speak, to salvage some sense of authority, but the moment had already passed. His assumptions had been laid bare, and Shaq had dismantled them without ever needing to raise his voice. Lisa, the flight attendant, let out a quiet breath. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, her tone now carrying the respect that had been missing before. "I apologize for any misunderstanding." Shaq offered her a small nod. "We all learn," he said simply. He reopened his tablet, signaling that, as far as he was concerned, the matter was closed. The passengers, still processing what they had just witnessed, gradually returned to their conversations. But the energy in the cabin had changed. A lesson had been taught, not through anger, but through the kind of presence that made words unnecessary. Shaq didn't need to win an argument. He had already won something much bigger: respect. The cabin had begun to settle, but an undercurrent of curiosity still lingered in the air. Shaquille O'Neal had handled the confrontation with remarkable poise, but for many passengers, an unspoken question remained: who exactly was this man? Why had he spoken with such quiet authority, as if he had nothing to prove yet everything to teach? Then, from the back of the cabin, a voice broke through the silence. "Wait, is that Shaquille O'Neal?" A young passenger, no older than 15, had been watching the entire exchange with growing recognition. Now, unable to contain his excitement, he turned to the others around him. "That's Shaq, NBA legend, Hall of Famer, the guy who's done so much for charity. I read about him in a sports magazine last week. He's the one opening the hospital for kids tomorrow." Murmurs spread like wildfire. Heads turned, eyes widened. Passengers who had remained silent before now sat up, their gazes shifting between Shaq and the man who had attempted to demean him. The weight of realization struck like a thunderclap. The man in the navy blue suit visibly tensed. His fingers, which had been gripping the armrest just moments ago in defiance, now trembled slightly. He looked around, seeing the ripple of reactions across the cabin, and his own face paled. Lisa, the flight attendant, blinked rapidly as the realization dawned on her. Her professional demeanor wavered, and she cleared her throat, suddenly aware of the gravity of her earlier misjudgment. "Oh my," she whispered under her breath. A passenger in first class, an older gentleman, let out a small chuckle and shook his head. "Well, that's ironic," he mused. A man who's done more for others than most of us combined, and here we are, watching someone question whether he belongs. Shaq remained where he was, his expression unreadable. He had never needed fame to validate his worth, nor had he ever demanded recognition. But as he saw the shift in the room, he recognized this moment for what it was, a lesson in how quickly perceptions could change when people looked beyond their own biases. The man in the navy suit swallowed hard. He glanced at Shaq, then at the passengers around him, as if searching for a way to undo his mistake. But there was no turning back. His arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only the weight of his own ignorance. I didn't know," he stammered. Shaq raised a hand, cutting him off not with anger, but with something more powerful. "You shouldn't need to know someone's name to treat them with respect," he said, his voice calm, yet firm. "That's the real issue, isn't it?" The words landed heavier than any insult, heavier than any public humiliation could have. The man had no response. A beat of silence stretched between them before Lisa finally found her voice. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, her previous hesitance replaced with something closer to reverence. "I deeply apologize for any misunderstanding." Shaq nodded, but said nothing further. He had already made his point. The shift in the cabin was undeniable. The same passengers who had once remained indifferent were now watching Shaq with newfound respect, understanding that they had been witnesses to something far more significant than just a disagreement in first class. The situation had been reversed, not because Shaq had sought validation, but because his actions had demanded it. And as the plane continued its journey through the sky, the lesson of that moment would stay with everyone on board. The air inside the first-class cabin felt different now. The weight of judgment and arrogance had been replaced by something else: introspection. The man in the navy blue suit sat motionless, his earlier confidence reduced to an awkward, shifting unease. The murmurs had settled, but the lesson still hung heavy in the air. Everyone had just witnessed how quickly assumptions could crumble when met with undeniable truth. Shaquille O'Neal adjusted in his seat, exhaling softly. He wasn't one to hold grudges. He had long understood that respect wasn't something demanded, it was something taught, something earned. And now, he had the chance to teach a lesson that would last far beyond this flight. "You know," Shaq began, his voice steady but powerful, "I've met a lot of people in my life. I've played in packed arenas, sat in boardrooms with billionaires, walked through neighborhoods where no one had anything to their name. And do you know what I've learned?" His deep gaze met the man's eyes, but his words were meant for everyone in the cabin. The man swallowed, unsure how to respond. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding without being forceful. "Respect isn't about money. It isn't about fame. It isn't about what seat you sit in or what clothes you wear. It's about how you treat people when you think no one is watching." A few passengers nodded subtly, their eyes locked on him. Some looked down, reflecting on their own quiet complicity in what had unfolded just moments ago. "I didn't come here to be recognized," Shaq continued. "I didn't need anyone to know my name. But the way I was treated today, that happens to people every single day. People without the privilege of having their name change the conversation. And that's the real problem." The words landed with a quiet force, the kind that made people rethink themselves. Lisa, the flight attendant, looked down at her hands, visibly affected. The man in the navy blue suit ran a hand over his face, guilt settling into his features. Shaq let the silence stretch for a moment, then softened his expression. "But the good thing about mistakes," he said, "they're only mistakes if you don't learn from them." The man inhaled sharply, then finally met Shaq's gaze. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice lower now, humbled. "I judged you before I even knew who you were." Shaq gave a small nod. "You judged me before you knew who I was, and I still would have been the same person, no matter what name was on my ticket." A ripple of understanding passed through the cabin. It was a lesson that would not be forgotten. The cabin remained unusually quiet. The weight of Shaq's words lingered, forcing everyone to confront something uncomfortable, the ease with which they had allowed prejudice to fill the space before them. The man in the navy blue suit, once so assured in his judgment, now sat stiffly, his hands clasped together as if searching for an anchor in his own remorse. Lisa, the flight attendant, shifted uneasily beside him. She had enforced the man's doubts, not because she wanted to, but because she had hesitated when she should have known better. Now, standing in the glow of Shaq's quiet strength, she saw the moment for what it truly was: a failure, not just of one person, but of many. The man took a deep breath and finally looked at Shaq. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something quieter, something raw. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let my assumptions dictate how I treated you. And worse, I let myself believe I had the right to question whether you belonged here." Shaq didn't answer right away. He let the man's admission sit, let it settle into the air. He wasn't here to humiliate anyone. That had never been his intention. He had faced these moments before on the court, in business, in everyday life. But the difference between a mistake and a defining flaw was whether someone chose to learn from it. Lisa stepped forward then, her hands clasped in front of her. Her professionalism now carrying a vulnerability that had been missing before. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I want to apologize as well. I let the situation unfold the way it did because I hesitated. I should have spoken up sooner." Shaq studied her for a moment, then nodded. "It's not about when you spoke up," he said, his voice deep yet calm. "It's about the fact that you did." Lisa swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," she murmured, relief breaking through her expression. The man exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he admitted. "But I promise I won't forget this lesson." Shaq held out a massive hand. "Forgiveness isn't something you ask for, it's something you prove." The man hesitated, then reached out and shook Shaq's hand firmly. It wasn't just an apology, it was an acknowledgement that he had changed. Around them, the tension in the cabin had lifted, replaced by something else: understanding. The journey would continue, but no one on that flight would see the world quite the same way again. The tension in the cabin had dissipated, replaced by quiet murmurs and exchanged glances of reflection. The man in the navy blue suit, still processing the weight of his actions, sat silently, occasionally stealing glances at Shaq. Regret was evident in his posture, but there was something else too, an unspoken desire to make things right. As the flight progressed, the man couldn't shake the irony of it all. He had walked onto the plane with confidence, believing himself to be someone of status, yet in a matter of minutes he had been humbled not by force, not by anger, but by the quiet dignity of a man he had been so quick to judge. And now, with the revelation of Shaq's true mission, the weight of his own hypocrisy bore down on him. Finally, after much hesitation, he turned toward Shaq, clearing his throat. "Mr. O'Neal," he started, his voice stripped of the arrogance it once carried, "I need to say something more than just an apology." Shaq, who had returned to calmly reviewing his notes for the event ahead, lifted his gaze and waited. The man hesitated, but then pressed forward. "The truth is, I'm on my way to that hospital opening too," he admitted. "I was invited as a guest donor. I've spent years working in philanthropy, helping raise funds for medical programs across the country." He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "And yet, despite all of that, I failed to live up to the very principles I claim to support." Shaq studied him, his expression unreadable. "I judged you," the man continued, "not by your actions, not by your character, but by something so superficial it embarrasses me to even acknowledge it." He shook his head. "And now I'm realizing that for all the work I've done, all the money I've contributed, I still have so much to learn about what real service, real humanity looks like. Shaq remained quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "It's not about how much you give," he said, his voice steady. "It's about how you show up, not just for causes, but for people." The man swallowed hard and nodded. "I see that now." The conversation took on a different tone after that. What had begun as a moment of confrontation had transformed into an unexpected meeting of minds. The man, once blinded by his assumptions, now saw Shaq not just as a famous athlete, but as someone with an unshakable commitment to making a difference. And Shaq, though used to moments like these, recognized sincerity when he saw it. By the time the plane landed, the two men, once strangers divided by prejudice, now walked side by side toward the same mission. Because at the end of the day, no matter their differences, they both sought the same thing: to give children a chance at a better future. As Shaq and the man stepped off the plane, The weight of their earlier exchange still lingered, but now it carried a different energy. The cold barrier of prejudice had melted away, replaced by a newfound understanding. The man, once so sure of his judgments, had come face to face with the depth of his own ignorance. And through Shaq's quiet strength, he had learned a lesson that no lecture, no amount of wealth could have taught him. As they walked toward the awaiting transport that would take them to the hospital, the man finally broke the silence. "I've spent years thinking I knew what it meant to help people," he admitted. "But today, I realize that charity isn't just about giving money. It's about seeing people, treating them with dignity, and recognizing their worth before anything else." Shaq nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Compassion isn't just something you show when cameras are watching," he said. "It's in the way you treat the person next to you, the way you choose to see people beyond the surface." The man exhaled, his gaze fixed on the hospital in the distance. "I won't forget this," he said. "I don't want to just be someone who donates. I want to be someone who listens, who understands." Shaq smiled, his towering frame radiating warmth. "That's a start." And with that, they walked forward. No longer just two men from different walks of life, but two people bound by a greater purpose. The lesson was clear: respect isn't earned through wealth or status. It's given freely, and in doing so, it has the power to change not just one person's perspective, but the world itself. The sun cast a golden glow over the newly built hospital, its glass windows reflecting the promise of a better future. Crowds gathered, their faces filled with anticipation as the ribbons stood uncut before the grand entrance. Doctors, nurses, community leaders, and the very children whose lives would be saved by this facility looked on with admiration. This was more than just a building, it was hope made tangible. Shaq stood at the forefront, towering not just in stature but in the depth of his commitment. The man who had once judged him now stood beside him, no longer with doubt, but with a sense of purpose. As the ceremony commenced, Shaq stepped to the microphone, his deep voice resonating with sincerity. "This hospital isn't just about medicine. It's about second chances. It's about making sure no child is left behind, no matter where they come from. Today, we are not just opening doors, we are opening possibilities." With a firm cut, the ribbon fell and the crowd erupted in applause. The hospital was no longer just an idea, no longer a dream. It was real, a place where healing, respect, and compassion would stand as its foundation. If you believe this story carries a powerful message, comment 1. If you think it could be even better, comment 2. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.